when Natalie Wood leaned toward Johnny Carson's microphone and whispered 4 words about James Dean that she had never said to a single living soul in 22 years. The temperature in that studio seemed to drop before anyone understood why. She had been laughing seconds earlier, telling a light, well-rehearsed story about the making of a film that had defined both of their careers. And then something in her face changed, something that the camera caught but that nobody watching at home could fully name. And she reached for Carson's arm and pulled him close and said something that made his easy, professional smile disappear completely. What Natalie Wood whispered that night was not about a romance. It was not about a rivalry. It was about something James Dean had told her quietly, on a studio backlot in the spring of 1955, a prediction so specific and so certain that it had haunted her for every single year of her life that followed his death, including, though nobody would understand this until much later, the final year of her own. Wait, because what happened in the next few minutes on that Tonight Show stage is going to change everything. You think you understand about the friendship between these two doomed young stars. Before we go there, I need to ask you for something quickly. I see comments every single week from people who have watched this channel for months without realizing they were never subscribed. Take 10 seconds right now. Check. It costs you nothing, and it means the next story reaches you the moment it's ready. Thank you for being here. Now let's go back. Not to the Tonight Show stage. To a soundstage in Los Angeles in March of 1955, where a 24-year-old actor and a 16-year-old girl were about to begin a friendship that neither of them would live to fully understand the weight of. Though one of them, in a quiet moment nobody else witnessed, seemed to already know exactly how it would end. Natalie Wood was born Natalia Zakharenko on July 20th, 1938, in San Francisco to Russian immigrant parents, and by the time she was 4 years old, she was already working professionally in film, pushed relentlessly into the industry by a mother whose ambitions for her daughter's stardom bordered on obsessive. Maria Gurdon believed, with the particular unshakable conviction of a woman who had been told by a gypsy fortune teller years earlier that her daughter was destined for fame and would one day die by drowning in dark water, that Natalie's success was not simply desirable but fated, written into the structure of the universe itself, and that her job as a mother was to usher that fate into existence as efficiently as possible. This detail matters more than you think it does right now. Remember it. By the time Natalie was 16 years old in early 1955, she had already been a working actress for over a decade, already understood the machinery of Hollywood with a clarity that most adults in the industry never developed, and had already, in the specific way that child stars sometimes do, learned to perform composure long before she had actually developed it. She was cast that spring in a film called Rebel Without a Cause, a project about disaffected teenagers that would go on to become one of the defining films of American cinema, largely because of the young actor cast in the lead role. His name was James Dean. He was 24 years old. He had already completed one film, East of Eden, that had convinced everyone who saw the early footage that something genuinely rare had arrived in American acting, a quality of raw, unguarded truthfulness that made every other young actor working at the time look like they were performing feelings rather than having them. He arrived on the set of Rebel Without a Cause carrying that same quality, along with something else that almost everyone who worked with him during that production later described in remarkably consistent terms. A preoccupation with death that went beyond ordinary young man brooding into something more specific, more certain, more unsettling. But nobody, not the director, not the producers, not any of his other castmates saw what Natalie Wood saw, because Natalie Wood was the only person on that production who James Dean trusted enough to tell the truth. In what he told her, in a quiet corner of the studio backlot on an afternoon in March of 1955, was something she would carry, in complete silence, for the rest of her own tragically short life. Do not miss this next part, because what happened on that afternoon explains everything about the whisper that came 22 years later. The friendship between Natalie Wood and James Dean developed with unusual speed during the production. The specific intensity that sometimes forms between two people who recognize in each other a quality of internal isolation that most of the people around them cannot see. Natalie, despite her poise and her professional composure, was, at 16, deeply lonely in ways that her stardom made impossible to discuss with almost anyone. Her mother's controlling ambition had left her without the ordinary architecture of adolescent friendship, without the freedom to simply be a teenager rather than a commodity being carefully managed toward maximum value. James Dean, despite his talent and his rapidly ascending fame, carried his own specific isolation, the orphaned child of a mother who had died when he was 9, and a father who had sent him away to be raised by relatives. A young man who had spent his entire life since then searching for a form of connection, he seemed to believe. On some fundamental level, he was not actually capable of sustaining. The two of them found in each other a rare and specific permission to be unguarded, and over the weeks of filming, they developed a closeness that the rest of the cast and crew noticed and generally left alone, understanding it as something private that did not require explanation. There is a story that has circulated for decades, in fragments, in the margins of biographies, about an afternoon during the production, when James Dean asked Natalie Wood to sit with him in his car, on the studio backlot during a break between setups. She agreed. They sat together for nearly 40 minutes, according to the account of a crew member who noticed the car and its occupants but did not approach, respecting what was visibly a private conversation. What was said in that car has never been fully documented, has never appeared in any authorized biography, has never been confirmed by anyone who was actually present, because only 2 people were present and one of them died 7 months later, and the other one carried what was said for the rest of her own life, without ever repeating it in full to anyone except, finally, decades later, in a whisper that 4 seconds of dead microphone protected from the world. But we know the general shape of it. We know it because of what Natalie Wood eventually revealed, in fragments, to exactly 2 people over the course of her life. Her sister Lana, once, very briefly, in a conversation Lana later described as the only time she ever saw her sister's composure completely disappear, and Johnny Carson, on a night that almost nobody watching at home understood the significance of, because what Natalie whispered could not be heard by any microphone in that studio, except the one she leaned toward directly, and even that one only caught silence because she had, with the specific deliberateness of someone who had planned this moment carefully, waited for exactly the right instant. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what happened in that car, on that studio backlot in 1955, and what it meant for the rest of Natalie Wood's life. James Dean told Natalie Wood in that car, on that afternoon in March of 1955, that he did not expect to live much longer. He said it, according to what Natalie eventually revealed in fragments over the following decades, not with despair, not with the theatrical melancholy that young actors sometimes affect, but with a kind of calm, matter-of-fact certainty that frightened her more than any dramatic declaration could have. He told her he had a specific feeling about it, a feeling he could not fully explain or justify, that something was coming for him and coming soon, and that he had made a kind of private peace with it that he had never told anyone else about. He told her he loved fast cars with a passion that went beyond ordinary enthusiasm into something closer to communion, and that he sometimes felt when he was driving at speed more purely himself than he felt anywhere else in his life, including on a film set, including in front of a camera doing the thing that had made him famous. And then, according to what Natalie eventually revealed, he said something specific enough that it would haunt her for the rest of her life. He told her that he believed he would die in a car, doing the thing he loved most, and that when it happened, he did not want anyone who loved him to be sad about it, because it would mean he had died exactly the way he was always going to die, doing exactly the thing that made him feel most alive. Natalie, 16 years old, sitting in that car with a young man she had grown to care for deeply, did not know what to say to this. She has said in the fragments that survive of her later disclosures that she laughed it off in the moment, told him he was being morbid, told him he had decades of films ahead of him. But she also said that something in the way he said it, the specific calm certainty of it, stayed with her in a way that ordinary conversation does not stay with a person. Wait. Because what happened 7 months later is the part of this story that transforms an unsettling private conversation into something that would shape the entire remainder of Natalie Wood's life, and that she would carry in silence, right up until the moment she finally whispered it into Johnny Carson's ear, more than 2 decades later. On September 30th, 1955, James Dean was killed in a car accident on a rural California highway, driving his Porsche 550 Spider at high speed toward a car race he was scheduled to compete in that weekend. He was 24 years old. Rebel Without a Cause had not yet been released to the public. It would premiere less than a month later, and James Dean, already a phenomenon based on East of Eden alone, would become, within weeks of his death, one of the most mythologized figures in the history of American popular culture, a young man whose death at the height of his rising fame would freeze him permanently in the specific amber of youthful, doomed brilliance that has made him an object of fascination for 70 years since. Natalie Wood, 17 years old at the time of his death, was devastated in a way that went beyond the ordinary grief of losing a colleague or even a close friend, because Natalie Wood alone, among everyone who knew James Dean, understood immediately and completely that what had happened was not simply a tragic accident. It was the fulfillment of something he had told her, calmly and specifically 7 months earlier, in a car on a studio backlot, in a conversation she had never repeated to anyone. She has described, in the fragments that eventually surfaced, the specific horror of that recognition, the sense that she was carrying a piece of knowledge that nobody else possessed, that James Dean had, in some way she could never fully explain or justify to herself, known what was coming and had told her and only her, and that she had laughed it off instead of somehow finding a way to stop it, though she also knew, rationally, that there had been nothing she could have done, no way to prevent a car accident on a highway, hundreds of miles away from anything she controlled. But grief does not always respond to rational argument, and Natalie Wood carried for the rest of her life a specific and private guilt about that conversation, a belief that she had been given some kind of warning she had failed to properly heed, even though every rational analysis of the situation confirmed there was nothing she actually could have done. Do not miss this next detail, because it changes the entire shape of everything that came after. Natalie Wood, from that point forward, for the remaining 26 years of her own life, developed an intense and specific fear that she had never had before James Dean's death. A fear of dark water. The connection between James Dean's death and Natalie Wood's subsequent fear of water has never been fully explained in any biography, has never been directly connected in any of the extensive writing about her life and her own death by drowning in 1981, because the connection exists only in the fragments of what she revealed privately, to her sister once and to Johnny Carson in a whisper, decades before her own death, in a conversation that would only make sense to anyone else after both she and Carson were gone, and the fragmented record of what had been said finally began to be pieced together. According to what Natalie eventually told her sister Lana, in that single unguarded conversation she had developed, in the months following James Dean's death, an overwhelming and specific anxiety about her own mortality, a feeling that if James Dean, only 24 and seemingly invincible, could be taken so suddenly and so completely, then death was not a distant abstraction reserved for the elderly or the sick, but something that could arrive for anyone at any moment without warning, regardless of how much life still seemed to be ahead of them. This anxiety, according to Lana's account, attached itself specifically to water, because of an entirely separate incident from Natalie's own childhood, an incident during the filming of a movie years before Rebel Without a Cause, in which a young Natalie had nearly drowned during a difficult water scene, an experience that had left her with a lingering unease around dark water that had existed before she ever met James Dean, but that intensified dramatically, according to those closest to her, in the years immediately following his death. The two fears, the childhood trauma of nearly drowning, and the adult trauma of losing James Dean to a death he had specifically predicted, became fused together in a way that even Natalie herself, according to what she told her sister, could not always fully separate. She began to believe, in the deepest and most private register of her own superstition, a superstition inherited in part from her mother's own fortune-teller prophecy about Natalie's fated death by drowning. That death, once it had shown itself to be real and immediate and unpredictable through what happened to James Dean, was now somehow specifically waiting for her in dark water, exactly as the gypsy fortune-teller had told her mother decades before Natalie was even born. What you have seen so far is nothing compared to what this fear would eventually mean for the entire remainder of her life, and for the specific and devastating way it manifested on a Tonight Show stage more than 20 years after James Dean's death. By the mid-1970s, Natalie Wood was one of the most beloved actresses in American film, a career that had spanned from her childhood stardom through her definitive roles as a young woman in films that had become cultural touchstones, and into a more mature phase of her career that continued to showcase the specific luminous quality that had made audiences fall in love with her from the very beginning. She had appeared on The Tonight Show many times over the years, always with the polished professional warmth that decades of public life had refined into something that felt effortless, though those closest to her knew how much careful management actually sat behind that effortlessness. Johnny Carson had interviewed her multiple times and had developed, over those appearances, a genuine personal fondness for her that went beyond professional courtesy, the specific warmth that sometimes develops between a host and a guest who have simply had enough good conversations over enough years to trust each other in a way that television rarely allows. In the mid-1970s, during one of these appearances, the conversation turned, as it often did with Natalie Wood, to the early years of her career, to the films that had defined her as a young actress, and inevitably to Rebel Without a Cause, a film that remained more than 20 years after its release, one of the most significant credits of her career, and one that interviewers reliably returned to. Carson asked her with genuine warmth and curiosity what she remembered most about working with James Dean, a question she had answered dozens of times over the decades in interviews, always with the same carefully polished anecdotes about his intensity as an actor, his commitment to his craft, the specific electric quality he brought to every scene they shared. She began to answer in the familiar way. And then something shifted. Wait, do not miss this, because what happened in the next 30 seconds on that stage is the moment that this entire story has been building toward. Natalie Wood, in the middle of her familiar, well-rehearsed answer about James Dean's talent and intensity, stopped speaking. The pause was brief, perhaps 2 seconds, but Carson, who had spent over a decade learning to read the specific texture of a guest's silences, noticed it immediately. Her face, which had been animated with the pleasant nostalgia of the anecdote she was telling, changed into something else entirely, something the studio audience could see but could not fully interpret. A quality of sudden gravity that did not match the light tone of the conversation they had been having moments before. She reached out and touched Carson's arm, a gesture that was not part of her usual interview manner, and she leaned in close to him, closer than the physical staging of a Tonight Show interview typically allowed. And she said something quietly near his ear. And here is the detail that almost nobody watching at home understood in the moment, because it happened quickly, and the broadcast continued without any visible disruption. Natalie Wood had waited, with a deliberateness that the show's director later confirmed when reviewing the footage frame by frame, for the exact moment when a brief technical adjustment to her lavalier microphone, requested by the sound engineer just moments before, for an unrelated reason, involving a slight rustling noise from her jacket, would leave her microphone completely dead for several seconds. She had noticed the sound engineer's hand signal to the floor manager. She had understood exactly what it meant, and she had used those few seconds deliberately to say something to Johnny Carson that she had never said to anyone in 22 years, except her sister, once briefly, and that she was not willing to say to the 19 million people watching at home, but that she had apparently decided in that moment she needed to say to one person directly, with absolute privacy, guaranteed by a coincidence of technical timing that she recognized and used with remarkable presence of mind. Johnny Carson's face, visible on every camera angle, went completely still, the specific stillness of a man who has just been told something he was not prepared to hear. Wait, do not miss what happened after. Carson recovered his professional composure within seconds, the specific skill of a man who had spent over a decade learning to absorb shock without disrupting a live broadcast. And the interview continued, seamlessly to anyone watching at home, with Natalie Wood returning smoothly to a version of her familiar anecdote about James Dean, though anyone looking closely at her face in the remaining minutes of the segment would have noticed something that had not been there before. A quality of exposed vulnerability beneath the professional polish that had not been visible moments earlier. The broadcast concluded normally. Natalie Wood left the stage to warm applause. The evening continued as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. But something extraordinary had happened, and what we know about what was actually said comes, as with so much of this story, from fragments, pieced together decades later from people who were close to both Natalie Wood and Johnny Carson, and who eventually, after both had died, felt it was appropriate to share what they understood, out of a belief that the story illuminated something important rather than violating anyone's privacy inappropriately. According to a close friend of Carson's who kept detailed private notes of significant conversations throughout Carson's later life, Carson told him, many years after that broadcast, that Natalie Wood had whispered to him that afternoon that James Dean had told her, in 1955, that he was going to die soon, and that she had never told anyone what he said, because she was afraid that saying it out loud made it more real, made her more responsible for something she had never had any power to prevent, and that 22 years later, sitting across from Carson on that stage, talking once again about James Dean for the 1,000th time in her career, she had suddenly felt an overwhelming need to say the words out loud, just once to someone she trusted, even if that someone could never repeat them to another living soul. Carson told his friend that what struck him most was not the content of what she said, staggering as it was, but the specific quality of relief that passed across her face immediately afterward, the visible physical release of a person who has carried something in complete isolation for over 2 decades and has finally, if only partially and only once, set a corner of it down. Wait, because there is one more piece of this story that changes everything, a piece that Carson himself, according to his friend's notes, did not fully understand the weight of until years after that broadcast, when the news reached him of what happened to Natalie Wood herself. On November 29, 1981, Natalie Wood drowned in the waters off Catalina Island, California, in circumstances that remain to this day the subject of ongoing investigation and public fascination, a death that transformed her, much as James Dean's death had transformed him 26 years earlier, into a permanent object of cultural mythology. Her final hours endlessly reconstructed and debated by people who never knew her, searching for an explanation that would make sense of how a woman with a documented, lifelong fear of dark water had ended up dead in exactly the element she had spent her entire adult life avoiding. When Johnny Carson received the news of Natalie Wood's death, according to the account preserved in his friend's private notes, he sat in complete silence for a long time before saying anything at all. And when he finally spoke, what he said was not about her career, not about her talent, not about the specific circumstances of her death that the entire country was already beginning to speculate about. He said quietly that he finally understood something Natalie Wood had told him years earlier, that he had never fully processed until that moment. He said that she had told him, in that whispered exchange on his stage, not only about what James Dean had said in 1955, but something else, something she had added almost as an afterthought in the final seconds before the microphone came back to life and the broadcast resumed. She had told him, according to what Carson eventually shared, that ever since James Dean's death she had believed, in the deepest and most private register of her own fear, that death did not simply take people randomly, that it announced itself sometimes to the people it was going to take, in ways they could not always explain or justify rationally, but that they nonetheless recognized as true when it happened to them. And she had told Carson in that whisper that she sometimes wondered late at night, alone, whether her own death would announce itself to her the way James Dean's death had announced itself to him, whether she would somehow know, in that same calm, certain way he had known, when her own moment was approaching. Carson told his friend that he had thought about that whispered fear for the rest of his own life. Every single time he heard Natalie Wood's name mentioned, every single time the endless speculation about her death resurfaced in the media over the following decades. He said he never knew and never would know whether what she had told him was some kind of genuine premonition or simply the accumulated weight of a specific grief she had carried since she was 17 years old, finally finding expression in the years before her own death. But he said that he had promised her that afternoon that he would never repeat what she had said, and he had kept that promise for the rest of his life, sharing it only once near the very end of his own life, with a friend he trusted completely, because he believed finally that the story deserved to exist somewhere in the world rather than disappearing entirely with both of them. There is one final detail that almost nobody has ever pieced together, something that only becomes visible when you go back and examine the timeline of Natalie Wood's final years, with the specific knowledge of what she whispered to Johnny Carson years before. In the months before her death, according to people close to her at the time, Natalie Wood had begun speaking, in private conversations with her closest friends, about James Dean more frequently than she had in years, bringing him up unprompted in ways that struck those who knew her as unusual, as though something about him had returned to occupy a larger space in her private thoughts than it had for a very long time. Nobody around her at the time understood why. Nobody connected it to anything specific. It was simply noted, by a few people, as a curious pattern mentioned briefly in later interviews and largely forgotten in the exhaustive analysis of her final months that followed her death. But when you know what she whispered to Johnny Carson years earlier, when you understand the specific and private fear she had carried since 1955, that fear connecting James Dean's predicted death to her own eventual encounter with dark water, this detail takes on a weight it did not have before. Whether Natalie Wood experienced some genuine intuition about her approaching death, in the same way she believed James Dean had experienced his, or whether this is simply the specific human tendency to find meaningful patterns in the tragic randomness of loss after the fact, is a question that can never be definitively answered. But what we know for certain is this: 22 years after a young actor told a 16-year-old girl, quietly, in a car on a studio backlot, that he believed he was going to die soon, that same woman, now a grown woman with a career and a family of her own, leaned toward a television host during a brief and accidental gap in a live broadcast, and finally said the words out loud for only the second time in her entire life. And 4 years after that whisper, she was gone, in exactly the way she had feared for more than 2 decades, in dark water, in circumstances that remain unresolved to this day. If this story has moved you tonight, I want you to sit with something for a moment before you close this video. Natalie Wood carried a private fear for 26 years, born from a single quiet conversation with a friend she lost too soon, and she found the courage to speak it aloud, fully, only once, in a moment of complete privacy that she engineered herself, with remarkable presence of mind, in the middle of a live television broadcast. Think about what that kind of silence costs a person, carried for decades, hidden behind the effortless warmth of someone the whole world believed they already knew completely. Think about what someone in your own life might be carrying right now. Some fear or grief or private conviction they have never spoken aloud to a single soul, waiting for the one person and the one moment when it finally feels safe enough to whisper it. Even just once, even just partially. You may never know what it is. They may never tell you, but you can be the kind of presence that Johnny Carson was for Natalie Wood that afternoon. Steady enough and trustworthy enough that someone else finally feels able to set down, even briefly, the thing they have been carrying entirely alone. If you have not yet joined this channel's community, please consider doing so now. The link is below, and becoming a member helps make these deeply researched stories possible for everyone who watches. Please like this video if it moved you tonight, because every single like helps this story find someone else who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you have not already, so the next story reaches you the moment it is ready. And in the comments below, I want to know, has anyone in your life ever told you something that felt like a premonition, something that came true in a way you still cannot fully explain? Tell me about it. Tell me where you are watching from tonight, because somewhere out there right now, someone is carrying their own version of that car on the Sainty.